Something you mentioned there is how Hegel kind of falls in line with like he's not doing anything that's essentially new. Like he definitely has new ideas, but in terms of like what his project is, it's very similar to stuff like the Gnostics. And like so in regards to their understanding of the self, um it seems to me like there is this notion that the self needs to be transcended, or at least our individual, like our ego, needs to be transcended. And of course, for Hegel, you have the subject, which the subject as like the individual I, like my ego, is very early on in his phenomenology of spirit. You got like, and that subject is negated and sublated, as to use his term, into absolute knowing in the end. And
Mhm.
so there is this idea that there is like a transcendence of the ego. Now, in Christianity, there's a similar idea to transcending your ego, and um, but it's not the same because for one, it doesn't involve the complete dissolution of the ego, and then you're sort of entering into like for example with what you were talking about with the modern technology utopia idea, like just entering into the singularity and losing your selfhood, and now you're part of this higher intelligence and stuff. So basically what I'm asking, asking to maybe expand upon is the distinction between the Gnostic, Hegelian, modern utopian idea of transcending the self and the ego in service of some higher intelligence, and how that compares to the Christian understanding of theosis. Because in theosis, there is, again, there is, you can understand it, and it is correct in a sense to say that there's a transcendence of the self, but it's not a transcendence of the self where you lose the self. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'll just let you talk about that.
Yeah, so the initial question was the relationship between Orthodox theosis and then more of progressive understandings of the development of self, whether it be
Yeah, like,
Gnostic or
and
Hegelian.
yeah, how they would be distinguished.
Um, well, it's going to come down to what's called personhood theology. So for Gnostics, and again, even Gnosticism's a bit of a tricky category itself because there's so many varieties of Gnostic schools and interpretations. But Gnosticism, generally speaking, to use it as a term, again, even though this has been debated, I have a book over here by a Gnostic scholar arguing it is a sort of dubious category, but it sort of relates to a Platonic Christian synthesis that develops a sort of existential understanding of the development of self. So one pursues and develops themselves in a way they learn more about the world. They gain more light, which is associated with knowledge itself. Gnosis, Gnostics. So gnosis is a Greek word for knowledge. So by acquiring more knowledge, one acquires more light, and therefore they acquire more divinity, and they acquire a better understanding of the state of the world, which for them is a sort of inversion of traditional Orthodox understanding. So the Old Testament for them is the devil. It is Yaldabaoth, Beelzebub. And Christ is a figure who came here to sort of penetrate the detritus of this sort of inverted, bastard creation of the world, and so that we can then understand this process. And so, therefore, we're all supposed to become like Christ. This is reminiscent of even like New Age understandings of Christ consciousness. But the point in how Gnosticism and Hegelianism would line up is this understanding that the self is something that is developed over time and it's progressively gaining more attributes, more divinity. For Hegel, his whole thing was about conceptual understanding. What the self, I mean, even within German idealism, what the self was debated. So Fichte, it had to do with morality. You had Schleiermacher, it had to do with religious experience. Schelling was more about aesthetics, and then for Hegel is more about conceptual understanding. So again, in a way, Hegel was very Gnostic because it was about, in a way, knowledge. And so as you acquire more knowledge for Hegel, the self is a sort of brief substantiation in time, and so eventually it's going to go away. And the point of the singular individuated self is really just a point in time in which the grand self, through this thesis antithesis process, is going to synthesize into absolute self. Really, these presuppositions come back to Plato and how people fall on the argument of the one and the many. Again, there's only so many worldviews people can have. So there's these fundamental questions that you can ask somebody, and where they fall on that is going to dictate where they can actually go. So on the one and the many, which one's more real, the one or the many? This is a easy question that sort of delineates the difference between Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy. For Plato, it was the one, the good, the true, the beautiful, the sort of transcendent ethereal realm. For him, the logos, the sort of demiurgic first creation of the good, was the point that housed all the archetypes. And so for him, the archetype is more real, more true, more important than the substantiation within space and time of the archetype itself. Because if you want to use a chair, the archetype of the chair has to precede us creating the chair. And so if we didn't have the archetype and we had all the chairs in the world, we couldn't create any more chairs. Whereas if we got rid of all the chairs in the world and we saw the archetype, we could create another chair. So this is the sort of framework of Platonic philosophy, which is a priori, to use a Kantian term, and then it's a deduction from there. Where Aristotle approached knowledge through induction, so he began with the multiplicity of the world, and so this is just a subtle distinction between Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy. Aristotle does induction and then deduction, and then Plato does a priori truth claims and then deduces from there. However, one of the common themes really within contemporary spirituality, most world religions, is the privileging of unity over multiplicity. And so this would be true for, there's variations of Catholic theology, but Thomistic theology, absolute divine simplicity, Islam, Neoplatonism, New Age spirituality, Hegelian philosophy, most Gnosticism would privilege unity over multiplicity in the sense that God is pure unity and that we are then in a progressive process, or there is a process in which we're all going to move back to pure unity. And so multiplicity exists, and maybe it's not, they may line up differently on how bad or less pure multiplicity is than singularity, but there's a presupposition that the many is lesser than the singular, the one. And so this is resolved in orthodoxy, which part of the beauty of Orthodox theology, which is distinct from what we would consider Western Christianity, is that it resolves many of what is called dialectical philosophical tensions between these categories, where when it comes to the self, we do not perceive the self as something that needs to be dissolved or transmutated into the singular process of the grand self, the cosmic self, cosmic consciousness, God, whatever you want to call it. But because we are then made in the image of God, we actually maintain our identity even into eternity. So those who believe that we would go to heaven, even though we are created entities, it would, because we're made in the image, it's this idea of personhood. And so person is a different, again, we're talking about Orthodox theology. So even though I'm saying person, try not to think of it as some general secular understanding of just like a voting person or a person with rights. We mean personhood means somebody made in the image of the Trinitarian God, which is one essence, three persons, which again comes back to this privileging of unity over multiplicity, and why only Christianity claims that the Godhead is both one in essence, but three in persons, meaning it's both one and many. Pythagoras talked about how three was the first number of multiplicity. So the Trinity itself, we understand it as one essence with three persons, persons being a divine category, us being made in the image, acquire personhood from being made in the image of God. And in the process of having a personhood, we can participate in these uncreated energies, which are natural to the persons of the Godhead. And so these uncreated energies would be like truth, logic, reason, compassion, mercy, understanding, honor, glory, all these things that you can't touch, but we all know are real. And these are things that animals cannot participate in. Language would be another one of these. Mathematics could be another one of these. These are uncreated energies of God, and we understand them as energetic realities. And that you and I, we just met. This is our first time talking, having this conversation, and we as persons are getting to know each other through energetic processes. So the way I move my hands, the way I talk, how I dress, the tonation of my voice, these are all energies. And then the things that I'm saying are energies. And so you're coming to know who I am as a person. I'm coming to know who you are as a person through energetic processes. We believe this is the way in which persons made in the image of God come to know each other, and that we are coming to know the Godhead through these energies, which I've just laid out, these uncreated energies. And so our goal then is to embody these energies, and this is lined up with a doctrine of the Eastern Orthodox Church called Theosis, which is a central sort of theological category that differentiates Eastern theology from Western theology. Western theology has things like sort of sanctification, but it's not to the same degree in explicit description as Theosis within Orthodoxy. In Orthodoxy, the whole point of the incarnation is for the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, to take on human nature. And so in doing so, basically builds a bridge that we then, as persons with only human nature, can cross into divinity. And we do that by participating in those energies, which we can only do by being persons, which is a different conception of self. And so we are not changing self through time. This is where it differentiates from Gnosticism or hegelianism or these different New Age worldviews. The self is not changing through time. The self is the same, but the self is being divinized and becoming more like God through this process. So then how we understand this is that it's the full unification of the one and the many. We maintain our multiplicity, our unique individual personhood, but we are then being unified through an energetic process of theosis by engaging in those things that are natural to the Godhead, maybe not as natural to us as men and women. So this theosis process is really the fulfillment of the one and the many coming back to each other, but it's not that we're being dissolved into the Godhead. We actually maintain our personhood, because if personhood comes from the image of God, God can't destroy our personhood, because that would be a sort of categorical sort of error. And so God doesn't, transgress our free will, and he wouldn't destroy our personhood, because we get those by being made in his image. And that's really why then everything's about love, and everything's about our free will choice to then participate in this reality.
That was